Hilchos Melochim, Halacha in the Rambam. The Melech mistabe b'chol yoyim. The king has to take a haircut every day. Misagen atzmoi. He has to rectify himself that he's dressed properly. Misnabe mushin noyim, and he becomes handsome with nice clothing. Umeforim, and outstanding. Shenema, as it says, the obligation, the posik melech b'yofyoi terzeno einecho. A king in his beauty, or shall you see, your eyes see. So we'll go down here. This is Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin Perikei Halacha Vov. It says, Yishayo, that you always have to see the king in it when he is enhanced. Because the Mishnah cites Sanhedrin 22b. The Chacham learned a king takes a haircut every day. And it says you should see a king in his beauty. And also by Yom Kippur, it's written that everyone is forbidden to wash their faces on Yom Kippur with a hot or cold in the water, and the king and a bride are permitted to wash their faces. A bride, she should not become degraded in the eyes of her husband, and the king, he should be seen in his beauty. It says the king and his beauty should your eyes rest upon. The Taz in Shabbos 260 says you should not cut his nails or cut your hair on Thursday, because it begins to grow on Shabbos. When I heard that on the third day after they're cut, they grow. If we cut them on the fifth day, they'll start to grow on Shabbos. The Morgan have our own questions that the people who went up to represent their grouping of the 24 groups that had to go to Yerushalayim would take a haircut on Thursday before Shabbos. How can you say you're not allowed to? Rashi explains the majority of people do it on Thursday, not on Friday, because it's difficult. They have so many things to do for Shabbos. It could be still is it better to do it on Friday, but they're not free at that time to do it. Shulchan Aruch Rav, and that Simon questions how a king does it every day. It means he's allowed to do it, and that means that every day the hair grows. It doesn't stop for 3 days, and he questions why the Mogen Avram says what he says. You find on the Kisei, and he sits on a throne in his palace. It could be its source from what it says, and when he shall reside on the throne, the Yomim Shlomo Amal sat on the throne of Hashem, because by sitting on the throne of the kingdom, that's when you have the beauty of the king. And he played Mason Kesef Rosh. He has to put a crown on his head. It seems every king of David had a crown on his head that fit him to be king, because the son inherited, and he's born with a space in his head. That there they place the crown properly. Halacha Aleph, it says it's forbidden for anyone to use that crown. The people come to him whenever they want. They come before him and they bow to the ground. Chodesh cites Tosis. They come and he sits. And even when he sits, they stand before him. Chodesh learns this from Posik. They bow. Even if the prophet is standing before the king, we find he has to bow like Nosan Adov did. Shenema says in Melochim 1, chapter 1, 23. Hine Nosan Anovi. Here's Nosan Anovi. He came before the king, and he bowed to the king on his face, with his face to the ground. Now, the law that you stand before him also applies to the head of the Sanhedrin, who has some of the rules of the king. And we find Hilchos Talmud Torah. And when the Nosi comes in, everybody stands up and they don't sit until he tells them, please be seated. In Hilchos Ovel, it says everybody's obligated to stand before a Nosi except for Ovel and a sick person. But just before the king, you have to bow as well. But Kohen Godol, a Kohen Godol in the Bostoner Rebbe does not come before the king. Ela im rotzo, but the Kohen Godol wants to, he comes. Ve'eino oimed lefonov, he does not stand before him. Ela Melech oimed lefnei Kohen Godol. The king has to stand before the Kohen Godol. Shenema, it says, "V'lefnei Elazar Kohen Yamid B'Shol Loi." When it comes to asking a question from the Urim V'Tumim, the chest plate of the Kohen Godol, then he shall come before Elazar Kohen, and he shall stand and ask the question. Yeshua had a rule of a king, as we learned before. He had to stand before Elazar. Aval became, even though that the king has to stand before the Kohen Godol, mitzvah la Kohen Godol lachabed es hamelech. The Kohen Godol is obligated to honor the king. Lo yeshivoy, to have him sit down. V'lamoid yiponov k'sheyovay. He should stand up when the king enters. Loi, and when the king comes to the Kohen Godol, l'yamen hamelech lefonov. King should not stand before him. Only when he has to ask what the Urim V'Tumim tell him to do. The Kohen Godol, that's one of the garments of the Kohen Godol had, as we find in Hilchos Migdosh. And you don't ask for a private person, only for a king or for the Sanhedrin, as it says before Elazar Kohen. And who came? That refers to the fellow person who was anointed for the wars. The king shall stand in Bnei Yisrael, and all the populace who need to ask. They stand before him. This is found in Sanhedrin 21b. Shiurim did not want the Klal Yisrael should go up to Yerushalayim because he saw that Recham ben Shlomo HaMelech sits in the Azor, and he'll have to stand. And it's easy as if Yehoram is standing before the kings of the house of David. There are those who point out that the king sits and everyone stands before him to a mechilta, shmois, and it says when Yisro came to Moshe Rabbeinu, who had a din of a king, that he saw, it says, Vayah Choisen Moshe, he saw Moshe sitting like a king and everyone was standing before him. In Yaakov, another Achronim question from what it says, even a Novi has to stand before the king, it would seem that the greatness of the king, the glory is greater than that of a prophet. In Brachos, in 10a, we find Maimonides said what it says in Kehelis, who is the one who's wise and who knows the explanation. Kodesh Baruch Hu knows to make a compromise between two tzaddikim. Ben Mishayahu HaNovi, who was a prophet, L'Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, L'Chizkiyahu was a king. Mishayahu had to come to the king. Like we find Eliyahu HaNovi went to Achov, so that when a prophet has to go before the king, Mishayahu though said L'Chizkiyahu Melech should come to him. That like Yehoram HaMelech ben Achov came to Elisha. What did Kodesh Baruch Hu do? He caused Chizkiyahu to be unwell. He said to Yeshayahu, go to be Makachoyla. And then the Halacha was never defined. He came there because of the mitzvah. And where does the Rambam get his Halacha? The Ein Yaakov explains that a Melech is before Kohen Godol, what we find in Horius 13a. A certain king is before a prophet, and regarding any prophet or glory. And the reasoning of Yeshayahu was that the Melech Yehoram went to Elisha when he needed him. Said, therefore, if Chizkiyahu Melech needs him, he should come to him. There was only the question if he needs him, like we find in the Medrash and Bereshis. The Pinchas had the same question, whether Yiftach was the Shofet, and Yiftach needed Pinchas, who should go to who? But because of it, we find that Pinchas lost the Kuna. And Yaakov adds that Chizkiyahu was of the opinion Yeshayahu has the obligation of a mitzvah of Hoicheach to Cheach, and therefore he has to come to the king and to admonish him. Yeshayahu was of the opinion that since the king needs the admonishment, the king should come to him to be admonished. Me'il Shmuel explains the reasoning of Yeshayahu according to the Rambam. A king can call whoever he wants, and they have to come to him to bow to him. And he doesn't write that a prophet is obligated to come to him, but even a prophet who stands before the king bows. Therefore, Yeshayahu was of the opinion he's not obligated to go. And with this, Yaakov's question is answered by the Rambam. It doesn't mention that the king can call the Navi, since it has not been clarified who's obligated to call who. The Zvash explains that Chizkiyahu was king only on 2 Shvatim. Therefore, Yeshayahu argued that he doesn't have a law of a king and he didn't come to him. Chizkiyahu was of the opinion he is a king and he cannot forgo his honor. The Zvash questions only a melech that forgave his honor is not forgiven, and a chochem who forgives his honor, it is forgone. Yeshayahu should forgone his honor and gone to the king. True saying Yitzchak, he answers, Yeshayahu did not go, Anavi did not go, because Chizkiyahu Melech had to do tshuva for the transgression of not being fruitful and multiply. Chazdei David explains that the Melech sat on his throne, and when he calls someone, the person stands before him. The Kohen Godol doesn't have to come, only if he wants to. And he doesn't stand, but the king stands before the Kohen Godol. The Me'il Shmuel adds, certainly the Kohen Godol does not bow to the king, but the prophet does bow to the king. Now, the Kohen Godol has the problem of the tzitz on his forehead anyway, as far as bowing. The Bryce in Hoyas is written, if he and his father and his master are captured, who is first to be redeemed? He has to be redeemed before his master, and his master before his father. When a Talmud Chochem, that means when a king is captured, I guess. Who's the who here? It's talking about where he has the money to redeem himself. When Talmud Chochem and the Melech are in captive, Talmud Chochem is before the king, because you need the sage that when the Melech dies, anyone else can be king, as we mentioned. And if a king and a Kohen Godol are in captive, the king is before the Kohen Godol. David HaMelech says, it's the Tzodek HaKohen HaGodol, and those that were with him, take with you the servants of your master. Rashi explains, the servants of your master, he means David meant himself, that he was master over Tzodek. So it seems that a king is greater. The Bryce continues, the Kohen Godol is before a Novi, because it says Tzodek HaKohen v'nosan HaNovi, it mentions Tzodek first. And it also says Shemano Yeshua HaKohen Godol Ata v'reacha Yoshem v'fonecha ki anshi moivus heimo. Because listen, Yeshua HaKohen Godol and the people that stand with you, because they are people of wonder, meaning you're prophets. Because it says Ki yokem b'kiyah b'chanovi, when we have a king, I'll give you a moifus. That the king precedes the Kohen Godol, the Kohen Godol precedes the prophet. The king is called to the Torah at the end of Shemitah. He reads at the end of Shemitah from the Sukkos, the mitzvah of Hakel, of gathering together. In the Mishnah, it's written that before him he has the Chazan HaKnesses, takes the Sefer Torah and gives it to the head of the Sanhedrin. The head of the Knesset, Sanhedrin gives it to his vice, and the vice gives it to the Kohen Godol. Kohen Godol gives it to the king. From here too, it seems we're going up in levels, and the king is of a greater level. The Kohen Godol gives it to the king. So the Chazan, the Shamas, gives it to the head of the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin to the Kohen Godol to the king. Hilchos Chagigo, Rambam says, brings the Mishnah that the Shamash of the Knesset takes the Sefer Torah, gives it to the head of the Sanhedrin. The head of the Sanhedrin gives it to the vice, and the vice gives it to the Kohen Godol. The Kohen Godol gives it to the king, to make more of a ceremony out of it. Why does you say the Kohen Gadol doesn't stand before the king? The king has to stand before him because of what it says in the pasuk over there. However, he emphasizes that even though, according to the din, the king has to stand before the Kohen Gadol, so it's on the Kohen Gadol to honor the king and tell him to be seated. Kohen Gadol has to stand before the king when the king comes, because the Kohen Gadol is not obligated to come before the king only when he wants to. The Chidah discusses a melech who swore that he does not know witness, and we find out that he falsified that statement, but he has to bring an offering for false oath, because a king does not say witness. So one of the wise men of that generation wrote in the Sefer Beis Avram that Kohen Gadol is greater than a king because he is holy, and therefore any denigrating of a Kohen Gadol is more stringent. The Kohen Gadol is not obligated to stand before the king, and the king stands before the Kohen Gadol. And the Chidah argues against him. So the Chidah argues from the Rambam here that Melech doesn't stand before a Kohen Gadol, only when he asks Mishpat Om V'Tumim. It would seem the opposite, that Kohen Gadol would have to stand before the king. Now both of them are found in the language of the Rambam. First he says the Kohen Gadol doesn't stand before the king, like the Beis Avram, and then he says that even though the Kohen Gadol has to honor the king and stand before him to have him be seated, but the king that comes to ask him by the Urim, there he has to stand, as the understanding of the Chidah. The Emek Netziv questions, the Rambam learned that a king has to stand before a Kohen Gadol. From what it says, before Elazar Kohen he should stand. He doesn't bring down his din. The Kohen Gadol is obligated to honor the king, and it would seem from what David HaMelech called Tzedek Kohen HaGodol, the servant of your master, it would seem that the honor of the king is greater. And the answer that the Rambam inferred from the pasuk, and before Elazar Kohen he shall stand, only at the time of the question the king is obligated to stand. Then the standing is not because of the glory of Elazar, but only the covet of the Shechina, the Kodesh that resides in the Kohen Gadol at that time. Thus we see that the king has to always stand before the Kohen Gadol, even when he's not asking in the Urim V'Tumim, and he always has to stand, and just that the Kohen Gadol has to honor the king to tell him to sit. But when he's questioning the Urim V'Tumim, he must stand. And Bohui the Suffering, for the great Poland before the war, cites and Sefer Zuta that Godol gave greatness to Lozo. Even the king has to stand before him. The Kohen Gadol doesn't come before the king only if he wants to. He doesn't stand before the king, and the king stands before him, because it says over here on this pasuk, before Elazar Kohen shall stand, and these are the words of the Rambam taken from the Sifri. Ha'amas Olam points out from that the Rambam is of the opinion that Minatoylem, king stands before Kohen Gadol every time that he sees him, because it says before Elazar Kohen he shall stand. It doesn't stand and he stands then. It means that there are two things that it says in the pasuk. Whenever the king sees the Kohen Gadol, he should stand up, and the king has to stand when he needs the Kohen Gadol to ask him to V'Tumim. Secondly, the king is obligated to stand when he needs the Kohen Gadol to answer the Urim V'Tumim. Therefore, the Torah says he shall ask in the Urim V'Tumim, and he brings proof that the words he should not stand only when he asks. He doesn't write that the king stands continuously, because what it says when he asks, he has to stand before the Kohen Gadol. But the Rambam explains that even though the law is that he has to honor the king, the king has to stand, the Kohen Gadol has to honor the king and have him sit. But when the king asks on the Urim, the Tumim, then the king must stand, even if the Kohen wants him to sit. We see from the continuation of the words, and so it's a mitzvah on the king to honor those who learn Torah because of the glory of Shemayim. So certainly the Kohen Godol. The Kiryas Melech. The Kiryas Melech. I'm going on Chaim Kanievsky Shlita cites in Peirush Rambam a disagreement between Pinchas and Yiftach, as we said before, that Yiftach made a neder when he came back from the Milchama, and whoever comes out of his house first shall be offered to Hashem. His daughter came out first, and he had to nullify the vow, and he would have to go to Pinchas, and Pinchas didn't want to go to him because he felt Yiftach has a king. A king has to come to him, and this was their disagreement. This was the problem: who was obligated to go to who. There's an obligation on the king, the Chabed Loimdei Torah, to honor those who study Torah. When they shall gather in front of him, the Sanhedrin and the sages of Israel, the king should stand before him, and he should have them sit at the side. And so did Yehoshaphat. Someone say it was Asa, should be the text. The king of Judah used to say, not only to the elders of the Sanhedrin, also somebody who was still a disciple, or he would get up from his seat of an Ashkan, he would kiss them, and he would call him my master, my teacher. When the king is alone in the house, he and his servants, he should do it in a modest fashion where nobody sees it. In public, before the people, he should not do so. He should not stand up for anyone. And he should not speak softly, or in other words, humbly to them. And he should call everyone with their name without a prefix. So that his fear shall be found by everyone. As it says in Dvorim, so you place upon yourself a king. His fear should be on you. The Mishnah cites Ksubis. Rabbi Yehuda Anosi commanded Rabbi Gamliel his son when he gave him before he passed away, and he gave over the prince to be prince of Yisrael. Do it with upraised arm, because a prince has some of the laws of attributes of a king, and have the disciples fear you. You shouldn't be light with them. Any more questions? What do you do with the fact that you have to honor those who fear God? So they answer that's your shofet. When he saw the Talmud Chacham, he would stand up from his seat, he would embrace him and kiss him, he would call him my master. The Gemara answers, the difference is whether you're allowed to do it in public. When you're not allowed to do it in public, you can only do it in private. Rashi says, in private, he can honor anyone, but in public, he has to place his fear. Sheva, Soita, Mem Aleph and Beis, explains that the mitzvah of the Melech is to honor Talmidei Chachomim, which is more than the obligation of Talmidei Chachomim to honor the king, because the positive commandment of honoring Torah is stronger than the positive commandment of honoring the king. And the honor of the Talmidei Chachomim is that emanates from the Torah, as Tosfos writes in Soita 41b, that the great Torah's honor is greater than the honor of the king. Furthermore, it was made similar, the honor of Talmidei Chachomim, to the honoring of heaven, because this is God, Hashem your God, you shall fear. Dvorim 6:13. It says S, and Rabbi Kiva adds Talmidei Chachomim. This includes sages. Always it says that the fear of your master should be like the fear of heaven. But we don't find that the fear of the king is made similar to God's fear. and we don't find that he is not obligated to fear God, therefore he has to honor Talmidei Chachamim. Sheva also points out from the fact that a king stands when he's stating witness, whereas Talmid Chacham does not. He does it seated, that the honor is greater of a Talmid Chacham. Furthermore, he brings from the Brisa in Horayos 13:8 that why a sage is before a king, because the Chacham who died, we can't replace him. The king who dies, everyone can be king. So the Shaul HaMelech, Yeshua, when they saw Talmidei Chacham, they stood up, embraced them, and kissed them. And even though the Gemara emphasizes that's only not in public, that's only regarding embracing and kissing them. But to stand up, he has to stand up, even in public. The Chazdei David, the Sefer Horayos says, why did the Rambam leave out that a sage precedes a king in honoring? He brings it the Peirush HaMeir as he writes what the Godol say, that a sage is before a king, and a king is before a Kohen Godol, before a prophet. That has many conditions to it. That the reason the sage is before a king is not only, it's only for the concept of belief, because the sage is beneficial to the entire nation more so than that would benefit from a king. But in action, one should not precede the honor of a king with anything else. Even when a king may be in an ignoramus, it says, place upon yourself a king. These are the words of the Rambam. And be'amuno, with belief, meaning that one has to believe that Talmid Chacham is greater value to the world. What is be'amunah? What does it mean that the sage deals with those items which have to do with theology, and the king deals with, if the king says don't listen to him, you have to listen to the sage. That's simple. It says from the pasuk in Yeshua, those who will go against your statements, but it says except, and that regarding the Torah, we're obligated to always keep the commandments, even if the king says not to do so. Therefore, the Chazdei David says that he said to the Rambam when he says with belief in theology in the heart, meaning a Chacham is greater than a king, but he shouldn't do an action to show that the sage before the king, because the fear of the king has to be upon you. From the pasuk, from the passage, shall you place upon yourself a king. And it could be that if he can give the honor to Talmid Chacham, that's the honor of the Torah, it precedes the honor of the king when it's not visible, such as to receive the king or to receive the Chacham. He can say, let the Chacham come first because it's more beneficial to the people than the king. And so too, if it's a question of drowning, the sage has to be saved first, but we have to make sure that he's not denigrating the honor of the king. The substance of what we said is that a king precedes everyone, even though if he is an ignoramus, and afterwards, and the other one is a sage. However, the sage should not be his master or his father. The king is before to give him livelihood, to honor him, but theologically, the sage is more beneficial than the king. The king is before a Kohen Godol, a Kohen Godol is before a prophet. Even a Kohen Godol, Meshuach Milchama, was anointed for war, wearing the garments that's not anointed from the Shemen HaMishcha, which was the case in the Second Temple, and that's the rules. Chazdei David concludes why the Rambam left this out of the halachas of this halacha.